Hello. Uh, Good morning to our colleagues in the Americas and Caribbean. Very good afternoon to our alumni and colleagues in Africa and Europe. And a good evening to those joining from Asia and the Pacific region. My name is Ronan Long. I'm the director of the Sasakawa Global Ocean Institute, and it's a great privilege and honor to welcome you all to this online webinar, a webinar on national pathways to maritime decarbonization, aligning a global ambition with local action. And this webinar is a part of a PhD journey. And this afternoon, we will be hearing from Lamin Jawara on his views on this particular topic, and he will share some of his PhD research results. First and foremost, I would say that the work that we do at the Global Ocean Institute is now focused on the triple planetary crisis. We're looking at biodiversity loss, climate change, that is to say human-induced climate change, marine pollution, and of course unsustainable ocean activities, including IUU fishing. Future Ocean Programme really is about projecting ocean governance over the next 50 years. And we're looking at four distinctive pillars. Firstly, regime and institutional interactions. Secondly, the role of non-state actors. Thirdly, ocean observation technologies and AI. And fourthly, then, is to project forward on to future ocean governance. I think the issue of climate change and the decarbonization of shipping is cross-thematic. It certainly touches on regime and institutional interactions. Non-state actors have a critical role to play. Indeed, new technologies will provide some of the technical solutions. And of course, this is going to be part of the future regime for sustainable ocean activities. I'm very pleased to see that I'm joined this afternoon by a number of my colleagues here in the university. And I would say congratulations to Pete Marriott, who is just being appointed as registrar of our university. And Pete is known to a lot of our alumni across the world. And we wish you, Pete, every success with your future endeavors. I'd also like to thank my colleagues in the alumni office, Charlotte in particular, for organizing this webinar this afternoon. And of course, I'm joined by my distinguished colleague, Dr. Tafsir Matan Johansson, who has been leading this research on the supervisory end, and of course by our wonderful PhD candidate, Lamin Jawara, who's from the Gambian Maritime Administration, a chartered engineer by profession, and has had a very wonderful career and is after undertaking some remarkable research over the last number of years here at the university. Without further ado, I would say that this webinar has a big global audience. I think we've close to 500 people registered for this event who will either follow online this afternoon or indeed follow the recording. So I would wish you every success, Lamin, with your presentation, which is part of your PhD journey. And I'd like to turn the microphone over to Dr. Johansson to introduce a little bit about your project and indeed some of the initial findings. Dr. Johansson, please.
Thank you, Director Ronan Long. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us from across the world. It is a real pleasure to be with you today and to see such an exceptional level of interest in this webinar with so many participants joining us. And this impressive turnout speaks clearly to the urgency and global relevance of this topic. And we are meeting at a critical moment for the maritime sector. And as we are aware, shipping sits at the heart of global trade and economic development, yet it is also under growing pressure to align with the world's climate ambitions. Now, countries face very different economic realities energy systems, port infrastructures, and development priorities. And yet, all are being asked to contribute to the same global decarbonization goals. And bridging that gap between shared global ambition and diverse local realities is one of the defining governance challenges of this present time. And therefore, the challenge before us is not only technical or economic, it is deeply strategic and institutional. How do we turn global climate commitments into practical, actionable, and fair solutions at the national and local levels? That is precisely the question at the core of today's discussion. And without further ado, allow me to introduce to you Mr. Lamin Jawara. And Mr. Jawara is a PhD candidate at the World Maritime University Sasakau Global Ocean Institute at Malmö, Sweden, where he is currently working on his thesis entitled Addressing Climate Change Emergency Governance in Global Shipping. He is a resident of the Gambia and works as the Director of Administration at the Gambia Maritime Administration. And Lamin is published with several scholarly articles on the topic of analogical reasoning, climate governance, maritime regulation, which resonates with the topic for discussion today. And we are therefore very fortunate to have him with us today to share his insights on national pathways to maritime decarbonization. And his perspective is especially valuable for countries seeking to balance ambition with capacity and global obligations with national development priorities. Lamin, we are truly delighted to have you with us. We look forward to learning from your experience, your research, and your vision for a more sustainable maritime future. The floor is yours, and we wish you all every success with your presentation. Over to you, Lamin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tafsir Johansen. Thank you for that generous introduction. And thank you, Professor Roland Long, for that brief introduction. Today's webinar, as Professor Tafsir have already highlighted, we are going to discuss how individual countries can shape ways to achieve a national pathway to maritime decarbonization, considering their unique circumstances. In doing so, we first start with the IMO greenhouse gas reduction framework. The IMO has set up an ambitious target to reduce greenhouse gas emission from ships to net zero by 2050. However, the framework has not identified or indicated how each country should achieve this objective, considering the fact that all countries have different circumstances, with different economic circumstances in different geographical locations. Today, that will be the topic for discussion. However, before we start, we first look at key topics. What does decarbonization mean for the global shipping industry? And then we'll look at what are the key drivers. And then we will look at what are the challenges. At the end of this webinar, we expect participants to be able to come up with a framework or a design for their individual countries that they can leverage and use as their roadmap towards decarbonization. Maritime decarbonization is quite important in the marine field because 80% of goods are seaborne. And because of the immense contribution shipping does in global trade and logistics, they also contribute 3% of greenhouse gas emission to global emission. As a result, the impact of this emission has several effects including environmental effect, but more so, the impact is higher on shipping itself. As the climate is changing, the globe is warming, sea levels are rising. At the same time, sea conditions are changing. This has a significant impact on the movement of ships around the world. If you go to the northern part of the globe, the ice around the Arctic area is also melting. This also has serious impact, which requires significant regulatory measures. We look at the key drivers, which includes, we look at the regulatory and policy aspect of it, fuel and technology shift that is existing. And also we look at the infrastructure and supply chain, how this can be leveraged by different countries, because all this have serious impact in terms of developing that strategy towards that net zero climate ambition put forward by IMO by 2050. However, there are key challenges, and these challenges include the fuels, lack of scalable and affordable fuels. Most of the fuels that we have today are either not scalable or they are currently at developmental stage. By this, we mean the green fuel, methanol, ammonia, and others. We also look at how technology can be leveraged to be able to reduce fuel consumption on ships, because as you know, fuel consumption is related to emissions. So if we are able to reduce fuel consumption, obviously emission can also be reduced. We look at port and bunkering infrastructure. And then we also look at the regulatory and policy aspects of this. Now we go into the topic of national pathways for maritime decarbonization. First, the definition. What are we looking at? We are looking at a strategic framework that will allow countries or nations to transition their maritime sector from their current emission status to net zero emission by 2050, using specific circumstances of those countries and coming up with timelines and investment plans to achieve those objectives. And the purpose of that strategy will be to bridge those national ambitions that have been set up by international regulation, by IMO and others, and looking at the special circumstances of countries. How are they going to leverage what they already have to contribute to this climate target? And therefore, we must be able to provide a clear and predictable roadmap to achieve this. And in doing so, of course, this will have to depend on different countries, because there is no one cap fit all in this, because of the special circumstances, the economic situation of countries. At the same, also the geographical location of the countries, because these have significant impact on what policies can be adopted. So first, we have to align shipping and port infrastructure development to national climate goals. And we must come up with policies, investment plans, and stakeholders that will contribute to this. So therefore, we expect such a framework to include policy and regulatory framework, alternative fuels and infrastructure strategy. It must also include how technology will be adopted along the transition, the investment and financial mechanisms that are needed to achieve this goal. Workforce and capacity development is critical. And also how we are going to put the governance and the stakeholders structure to be able to support this endeavor. in terms of aligning ambitions with realities, we have to look at the special circumstances of those countries. There are certain countries that have the financial capacity, and there are others that do not necessarily have the financial capacity. What measures do we have in place to ensure that everybody comes on board? There are countries that are uniquely suited in certain geographical areas that are located on major shipping lanes, and they are able to leverage, for example, leverage on bunkering. But there are some that are not necessarily be able to do that because of their position within the globe. There are certain areas also that are economically viable, where shipping companies are located, and this stakeholders' engagement can be encouraged. But there are others where, in terms of their contribution to maritime trade, the major stakeholders are missing around that area. So how do we put all these perspectives together? Policy instruments are quite key in terms of achieving whatever objectives a country desires to do. However, we look at certain key areas, policy instruments that can be leveraged by countries. Because one thing is important here, it does not necessarily mean that to contribute to maritime decarbonization, you have to have an infrastructure to supply bunker. No, not necessarily. It is for every country to look at your unique circumstances. What do you have in place that can contribute to this net zero framework by 2050? So every country could have a separate perspective towards this objective, whether it is based on fuel pricing, whether it is based on using port incentives, through encouraging renewable fuel usage or vehicles, electrical vehicles, whether it's going to be providing shore power to ensure that when vessels are at the port, they are not using fuel and they are not emitting in the environment. Fuel standards are also important, ensuring that we have the necessary safety and fuel quality standards and certification to ensure that fuels are what we say they are. Research and development also is key to this endeavor. There are also the technologic pathways where we use alternative fuels, for example, green ammonia, methanol. Though some of these are in the developmental stage, and some of them, even though they are ready for the market, but they are extremely expensive. Some of these alternative fuels could be 2 to 4% more than the normal marine fuels. But then how countries could use some of these things to be able to efficiently contribute towards this goal. This is what is key. There is also the energy efficiency technologies, designing our hulls, hydrodynamic enhancements, improving engine designs and propulsions, energy management systems on board. All these are routes that can be used by countries towards this decarbonization. Digitalization is also an important tool, as when a vessel is digitalized, fuel consumption can be controlled such that emission is reduced. Also, we look at smart ports are also key because of the efficiency in handling vessels around the area, as well as the autonomous ships and those systems. So these are all pathways that can be used by countries. So we will look at some case studies. First, we will look at few countries. We look at what they have in place, their national strategies, and we look at pilot cases. And also we will look at the lessons learned from those pilot cases and all those national strategies, and see each country how they can leverage on some of these things to fit their unique circumstances. For example, there are some national strategies that have been developed by certain countries, including Norway, Japan, Singapore, United Kingdom. All these countries have roadmaps, but no two countries are similar. For example, the Norway has an integrated zero-emission maritime strategy, where they have a broad vision for all ships to reach net zero by 2050. Japan also has a roadmap for zero emission, and Singapore has a decarbonization blueprint. UK is looking at clean maritime plan. All these maritime plans and frameworks that countries have are all at different stages of implementation. They all resonate success stories which other countries can learn. It does not necessarily, we do not necessarily have to wait until they have reaped the fruits on before we implement or we follow suit. But each country can develop a separate strategic framework depending on its unique proposition. There are also some pilot cases which are key because there are a lot of uncertainty when it comes to maritime decarbonization. Because today, we are not really sure which fuel will be the fuel of the future. So for that reason, there is also inertia for investors to invest in a certain fuel. And even if a certain fuel is available, what is the cost of that fuel? So as a result, a lot of pilot cases are happening. But more so, what is most important more so today is the green corridors. For example, the Singapore and Rotterdam Green Corridor. These are initiatives that can be used by countries and can be used by regions. In a way, the country or the region will also be contributor to maritime decarbonization. Chile, South Korea, Netherlands all have their separate pilots that are going on. For example, the Netherlands is more of port electrification and digital optimization. The port of Rotterdam is implementing onshore power and hydrogen pilots and large-scale digitalization tools that can make ships more efficient and reduce emission. The lessons learned so far would be to ensure that countries align their national strategies with what is unique to them, what they have. For example, we don't expect a country to develop a kind of a strategy that they do not have funding for. But it can be simply changing the machinery around the port, electrifying the port equipment, ensuring that they're electrical, or providing shore power within the port, so that when ships are at the port, they are not emitting in the environment. But for countries that are on the shipping lane, they can develop infrastructure. So the important thing is now to ensure that we have policies in place that can attract private investment. Pilot projects that can develop fuel and new technologies, ensuring that we are starting something in the early stage. While we do all this, we have to be mindful of the the progresses, and those progresses must be measured. If we do not measure those progresses, it will be difficult at the end of the day to know where we are on the roadmap. One of the most effective, or the first one I will share, is the emission intensity, the total greenhouse reduction roadmap. If you see this diagram here, addressing climate change, you can see 2050, we are heading toward net zero. But while we go through this transition, a lot of things can be done. We must look at how many vessels we have within the mix that have zero emission. We must be able to measure that. We must be able to measure how much fuel that is renewable or alternative fuels that ships are able to uptake. We must be able to measure port electrification and green bunkering in the different ports. We must also be able to measure the fleet operational efficiency, such that we know each of these KPIs, how much they are contributing and where we are at any one time. Data is also important in terms of measuring progress. The fuel types and the consumptions, these are important to measure. For example, container vessels, bunker carriers, oil tankers, general cargo. How much are they lifting in terms of renewable fuel? How much emission are they doing? These have to be measured. Voyage activity and performance also have to be measured, because this also have an impact on emission. Port emission also is quite important. Alternative fuel production, how much fuel are we able to produce? Because this also has a significant impact on implementation and the use of such fuels. As long as the amount is not adequate, then it will be difficult for many ships to be able to adopt these systems. Standardized digital logs are also key, and this we must work with private data collectors, governments, international organizations, IMO, to be able to gather this data. We must also have monitoring systems to be able to, because monitoring provides credibility to the data. So we must be able to have a plans for verification, for collecting data. And those collections must also be traceable. We should be able to develop digital reporting portals that are transparent, third-party verifications, port-level environmental dashboards. These are all tools that we can use. My recommendation is policy adherence. Without policy, it will be difficult to achieve any meaningful goal towards decarbonization. Infrastructure is important, ensuring that we have the necessary infrastructural framework for the ports in terms of providing coal ironing. For bunkering stations, these are all important, but they can only be done through planning and investment. Pilot projects also needs to be encouraged. Coordination, ensuring that there is local, there is regional and international coordination. Also, support is needed, because not all countries have equal access to finance. And also capacity building, ensuring that there is just an equitable transition within the various arrangements that we have. But also, we also must understand that all these strategies should be unique to individual countries, so that countries do not necessarily have to struggle to achieve some of these objectives. In conclusion, the national pathways are essential because it paves a clear roadmap towards achieving decarbonization, but ensuring that they are within the national framework of a country in terms of investment, in terms of planning, in terms of collaboration. And local industry also needs to be encouraged. And also, the national action, especially having governments, communities, to come together and support these causes. I think they are also important. Thank you for listening, and I'm ready to take any questions.
Thank you so very much, Lamin. You have indeed piqued the interest of the audience gathered here today with a timely and very well presented, structured presentation. So we will now open the floor for discussion, beginning with a few questions to deepen the dialogue. And I wanted to start off with a brief comment. So one of the strongest threads running through your presentation is the emphasis on policy coherence across climate, energy, transport, and industrial sectors. And you show very clearly that maritime decarbonization cannot succeed in isolation from national energy systems, port development strategies, and industrial policy. Now, yet in practice, coordinating across ministries and regulatory agencies remains one of the most difficult governance challenges. So based on your case studies, I would like to start off with this question. So what specific governance mechanisms have proven most effective in preventing policy fragmentation at the national level? Thank you, Lamin.
I think the most challenge we have when it comes to policy is because the policies are usually take a top-down approach, where a policy is developed and departments are expected to implement. I think this is quite challenging. But from my research, what I learned is when policies are developed through a stakeholder approach, all the stakeholders take ownership from the early stage of that policy, and they all work towards supporting and implementing it. But then at that time, the weaknesses and the strengths and limitations of those stakeholders are also identified at the early stage, so that implementation now would not become a problem. This has been my perspective as far as my research is concerned. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. So I'll just follow up with another question from one of our participants, a Tammy Juguna. I hope I've pronounced the name correctly. So are there any plans, perhaps through IMO MTCCs, for best fit clean energy solutions and capacity readiness programs? What about initiatives at the international level, if we're looking at a top-down approach, please?
You know, for now, there are a lot of uncertainty. At this time, nobody can tell you this is the fuel of the future. And because of that, there's a lot of investor inertia towards developing one particular fuel. And also, bunkering stations is a challenge. The other factor is the current renewable fuels have low energy density. So because of that, you need to carry a significantly higher number of fuel than what we currently have. So because of that, it's taking a lot of space that should have been taken up by cargo. So these are all challenges. But all these sectors, all the international organizations, research, everybody is working on this. Though there has been some progress, but definitely there's still a lot of challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Lamin, for that. So in the context of challenges, we have noted the delay in adoption of IMO Net Zero framework. In your opinion, how does that impact the decarbonization agenda at the global level?
You know, decarbonization is very difficult to reconcile, looking at, you know, how the perspective of different countries. Because it is very expensive to develop renewable fuel. And even so, a lot of countries do not have this capacity to do so. But at the same time, countries have their unique particular circumstances, and they also have their national interests. So this is why what we are proposing is for countries to look within their unique circumstances and develop a framework that will contribute towards decarbonization. This is what has been my view on this issue, Professor.
No, thank you for that. And again, just coming back to equity and developing countries. So particularly important contribution of your work is the attention you give to equity and the challenges faced by developing countries. But while many advanced economies are already deploying pilot projects, alternative fuels, and green corridors, or low-income maritime states often still struggle with basic port electrification, fuel access, and monitoring systems, you rightly emphasize the need for climate finance, technology transfer, and capacity building. So building on this, my question to you is, are there any practical financial models that exist? And do you see as these being viable for enabling, coming back to the topic of your presentation, the national maritime decarbonization pathways?
You know, there are financing schemes that has been developed through the national adaptation plans. However, maritime decarbonization is not included in this framework. And the IMO greenhouse gas emission framework does not necessarily have an analogous framework for financing decarbonization, which means countries have to develop their own financing scheme. Though there is provision for countries to be supported in terms of capacity building and others to ensure that they also adopt the necessary frameworks and or the policies and implement such that they contribute. But in terms of financing, there is no clear cut stipulated way on how this could be achieved. So this is a significant challenge, Professor.
Then in that case, how can individual nations translate the IMO's global decarbonization targets into practical domestic policies that account for local economic, technological, and operational realities? A question that comes from a Nelson Ibiota. Please, Lamin.
Countries have to look at their unique circumstances. They have to look at their economic circumstances. They have to look at their geographical locations. They have to look at what advantage they have within the area they are operating. For example, if you are within the major shipping corridors, there is opportunity to have a bunkering system within your port, knowing that vessels will definitely pick up that fuel within the port. But then if you are not on major corridors, this is not possible. But then each country can have a unique approach. If the country is able to fund only providing shore power within the port, this is a good starting point. If a country is able to electrify all the port equipment within its port, this is also another contribution. Because there is not a clear-cut and pathway for this. Each country should contribute towards this goal. But it is not one size fits all circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you, Lamin, for that focus on the much needed tailored approach to this existential crisis. Now, we have another question from a Cyrus Johnson from Liberia. So, and the question is, considering the huge gap in infrastructure development in ports, technological advancements and capacity development between advanced countries and underdeveloped countries, do you think the realization of the 2050 target by countries is a reality/possibility, please?
At this stage, it is difficult to say. But what is important for countries to focus in developing their national pathways? Because as we move along the way, there must be some assessments. And this is why it is important for us to measure as we go, and for us to collect data as we go, and ensure that those, and also report, and those reporting should be as transparent as possible. But then each country should come up with their own strategy. I think this is a good starting point.
Okay, thank you. So moving on to the next question. So this is from a Anirudh Nair. So with ammonia expected to play a major role between 2030 and 2040, despite safety and toxicity concerns, how is your research at our university viewing hybrid transition approaches where ships do not depend on one single fuel, but combine efficiency, renewables, and multiple fuels as a lower risk path for industry, please?
You know, ammonia is a viable future fuel, but it is still under development. And as I said earlier, these fuels require a lot of investment. And since we do not have, there is not an agreement to identify a single fuel for the future, it is difficult for investors to put all their eggs in one basket to be able to develop this fuel. And even the transition is a difficult journey to manage, because the reason being, the cost of that fuel is significantly high. There are some that suggest it could be three to 5 times higher. And the volume, because their energy density is also low, so the volume you need is higher than the normal fuel that we are using today, the marine diesel fuel we are using today. So because of that, ship owners will be losing cargo, revenue on cargo, because what the cargo should occupy is what the fuel is going to occupy. So this is a very uncertain route to navigate. But then there should be an increased research and discussion on this matter. Thank you, Professor.
So that's wonderful to hear. But then again, if we move towards seeing the future of the industry, so how optimistic can we be in reaching a net zero emissions from the shipping industry, taking into account the recent occurrence at the international level, especially at the IMO level? So what are your thoughts about that, Lamin, please? And this is a question that came from Mohab Abul Kawam, please.
Yes, indeed, there are some setbacks at the IMO level in terms of adopting the current greenhouse gas emission strategy. However, it's been, I think, pushed for another 1 year for IMO to look back into it. But then this is something that countries do not necessarily have to wait. Because at the end of the day, even that strategy pass is going to depend on how countries are going to implement these strategies towards achieving this goal. And this is why, as far as this seminar is concerned, what we are focusing on is to look at national pathways that each country can develop a strategy that is unique to their circumstances. I think this is what, Professor, we should focus on now.
And what about risk management, including training? And this is a question that came from a Mr. Ahmed Farid. Please.
I think risk has to be managed across the value chain. Today, shipping has a higher risk than before because the sea conditions are changing because of climate change. New routes are being opened up in the Arctic area. That needs to be charted. That needs to be regulated. So these are higher challenges. A lot of port infrastructure are today inundated because of sea level rise. There is a higher risk and impact on the supply chain because of flood and wildfire. So these risks have to be mitigated along the value chain. But then also, we must come up with a strategy where we can include adaptation within the mitigation framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Lamin. And this is a question from a former student from the class of 2025 of World Maritime University. So considering the uncertainty in fuel pathways, what kind of infrastructural investment would you encourage ports to pursue, please? And I think this requires a very, very concrete answer, especially considering your experience in this area. Lamin, please take it away.
Thank you, Professor. But I think this will depend on the unique circumstances of each individual port, because one answer would not fit all ports. There are certain ports because of their unique position, geographical position, they are able to adopt certain measures. For example, develop infrastructure for fueling and bunkering. But for example, a port that is off the major shipping lane, if you develop infrastructure for fueling, how many ships are going to fuel there? So even though those may be a good strategy for a certain port, but they may not necessarily be a good strategy for another port. For another port, maybe the best strategy would be to provide a coal ironing station, so that when ships arrive, they can use the port without necessarily emitting the environment. Maybe for some ports, the best strategy will be to ensure that they transform their cargo handling equipments so that the cargo handling equipments uses less emission. Probably for some ports, the best strategy will be providing incentives for those trucks and vehicle owners so that they reduce emission as they go in and out of the port. So there are a lot of different strategies, but as I said, there's no one size fits all. Thank you.
Then, in which case, Mr. Shahidullah Khan asks, what about artificial intelligence and the role of artificial intelligence in maritime decarbonization? Please, Lamin.
I think artificial intelligence has a lot to contribute if properly harnessed. I have talked briefly about digitalization and how digitalization contributes in reducing decarbonization. Artificial intelligence is even more powerful, but they must be deployed rightfully. They can be deployed in fuel design, in engine management, in engine design, in vessel routing. They can be deployed in a lot of areas. And of course, they can contribute to maritime decarbonization. Thank you.
And we have another very important question from Nairobi, Kenya, from a Fred Kungu. So how can we meaningfully engage the private sector in shipping decarbonization, as they hold much of the finance and many of the solutions, yet they are not consistently included in the decision making process at the tables? Please, Lamin.
I think the involvement of private sector is key to achieving decarbonization. A lot of ports are struggling with outdated equipment because they do not necessarily have the fund to replace those equipments. The private sector can contribute to this endeavor. Private-public partnership, I think, is an important model to assist in decarbonization roadmaps for countries. I think these are key. And then the private sector, they are important and they are important partners. And within the stakeholder framework, they must always be included. This is my view and perspective on this matter, Professor.
Thank you. So we have a very timely question, and I'm not really surprised. It has come from one of our registered participants, and I'm particularly interested in this answer, Lamin. So given the growing use of the term just and equitable transition in maritime decarbonization, what would it take to establish a standardized and operational definition of just and equitable transition that countries can meaningfully apply when designing national maritime policies and action plans, please?
The just and equitable, transition can only be managed and discussed at the international policy level, because this is looking at what other countries, by virtue of the amount of pollution they are doing, how do they offset some of those costs to ensure that developing countries and other countries are also participating. But as I said, we cannot have a just and equitable transition, or we do not have yet. But these are important points that should be discussed at the IMO. And this has to do with implementation. Even though, if you look at the IMO framework, it is talking about capacity development for developing countries, supporting developing countries to ensure that they also contribute accordingly. But then, this will take time to implement. And those frameworks that should support the implementation of those funding agreement or capacity building is open to interpretation. So unless we come up with concrete frameworks on how capacity could be developed and how other countries should develop and what should be their engagement level, unless we define this, it will be difficult to put in a clear-cut policy to say this is it for individual countries. So, but at this seminar, what we are looking at is individual countries, how they can develop their own. And this particular one, that should be developed at the international framework, within this international framework, has to support those individual country pathways or initiatives. So I think, that is important, and that should come to support the national pathways of different countries. But then, for a start, the countries should develop their own strategies. And then, within the plan, look at how they are going to fund those specific objectives. But then, as at now, even though the provision is there, but there is not a clear program towards this. Thank you.
Thank you, Lamin, for that very insightful response. And I think because we are squeezed for time, I will kindly ask you to take a bow, but we have taken note of the questions and we will get back to the registered participants with those answers as deemed appropriate. So thank you once again, Lamin, and I commend you for a compelling, very rigorous and highly policy relevant presentation. And today's discussion has shown us clearly that maritime decarbonization is not just about fuels or vessels. It is about governance. It is about finance, data, and long-term institutional coordination. And your work indubitably demonstrates how global climate ambitions can be translated into nationally grounded, actionable pathways that are both technically credible and politically meaningful. So as we approach the conclusion of today's webinar, it is my distinct pleasure to pass the floor to my director, Professor Ronan Long, who will offer the closing remarks and formally bring this very engaging and productive session to a close. Professor Ronan Long, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Congratulations, Lamine. You did yourself proud. We're immensely impressed with the breadth and depth of your knowledge, your findings, and the very clear presentation. I would like to draw attention to these wonderful papers that you've done, which are open access papers, including those in the Ocean Yearbook, and they're included in the last slide there. So I would also encourage the worldwide audience and commend you for your engagement on this particular topic. This is a big global issue, and it's really heartening to see our alumni and stakeholders from across the world. And I would say a very warm thank you to Nancy, who was on our Board of Governors, who joined this afternoon from Nairobi, Kenya, as well as Thomas Klingam, a very distinguished member of the shipping community that has participated in our projects and programs here at the Institute. Particular warm thank you to the Alumni Office. And the Alumni Office does a wonderful service to the university and to our distinguished graduates across the world in bringing our community together. And I would encourage all of you to stay engaged, stay active. And of course, my last thank you goes to you, the audience. It's really wonderful that we've had people from the Pacific, Asia, Africa, very strong alumni association, of course, in the African region, as well as in the Americas and the Caribbean. So the World Maritime University is truly a global university, as reflected by this webinar. I should mention my colleague, Dr. Tafsir Matan Johansson, who has led this research, and we wish you every success at the end of this journey now is Lamine Jawara, who will be undertaking his PhD viva voce, his doctoral examination within a number of months. I think this is the last step on the academic journey. Without further ado, I wish everybody a very happy and safe end of the year. Please stay engaged, and we look forward to rolling out the red carpet here at the World Maritime University. It's a dull and grey day in Sweden, but there will be a very warm reception for each and every one of you when you return to your alma mater in due course. So from Malmo this afternoon, good afternoon, of course, to our colleagues in Asia Pacific. We say good night, and of course, to those in the Americas, I think maybe the late morning. So good morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.